So we've covered how to properly do a retcon with Bug Gribble. Now it's time to look at how to not do a retcon, and that leads us to Maddy Platter and the out of left field episode that was a Rover Runs Through It.
I am not some redneck, and I'm not a Hollywood jerk. I'm something else entirely. I'm complicated.
Hey folks, welcome to Squirrel Tactics. Like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, let's do this. Maddy Platter, and even though her appearance and character changed completely, in all of her appearances, she was voiced by Joanna Gleason. Honestly, I didn't believe this at first, but after checking with IMDb and watching the credits for every episode she appeared in, yeah, it was just Joanna Gleason doing the voice. Anywho, she's the mother of Peggy and Hoyt, grandmother of Luann and Bobby, and great-grandmother of Gracie. She may also have a brother who is a dirty, drunken rodeo clown, though he may have been Peggy's uncle on her father's side.
My uncle wasn't a cowboy, Hank. He was a dirty, drunken rodeo clown.
Don't tell me. Uncle Boffo?
Supposedly, she moved down to Texas from Montana around the time Peggy was in high school. It was never very clear the whole timeline there. What really matters is that Peggy went to West Arlen High and she lived with her mother. Maddy's appearances in her original form were mostly in flashbacks, such as her first appearance in Square Peg, when Peggy thinks back to her mother having the talk with her and how it wasn't that helpful.
Honey, you're at that special time of life, the time when a little girl becomes a woman, and you start getting a monthly visitor.
Who? Uncle Joe?
My mother gave me this, and I'm passing it on to you.
The loveliness of woman. There's nothing in here but pictures of flowers.
Yeah, apparently Maddy was just as uncomfortable with the subject as Peggy was. Also explains where Peggy gets her modesty. Actually, a lot of Peggy can be learned by looking at Maddy. An example of this was her second appearance in I Remember Mono, when she came across Peggy trying to cook for her and Hank's first Valentine's Day together.
Hon, this is so cute. Your first big meal. It must... Peggy, you are not trying to make...
That's right. Beef Wellington.
And here we see Maddy questioning Peggy's abilities in the kitchen, warning that Hank can't find out that Peggy can't cook. And we also see the dynamic between the two, with Peggy arguing back.
Cherry pie? Why not just build him a rocket ship?
Mom, would you stop it? He is my boyfriend. It is my dinner. I will cook it.
But Peggy, if Hank discovers you cannot even bake, it is all over.
You think I can't see that?
We also learned that Maddy doesn't allow the use of contractions.
Do not say can't. You will not use contractions in this house.
By the way, she used your and I'm when giving the talk earlier, both of which are contractions, but whatever. In that same episode, Maddy gives Peggy a compliment when she sees her crying after she did a terrible job at cooking.
Phone call for you, dear. Your eyebrows look very nice.
To be fair, she complimented her to try to make her feel better rather than giving her the good old-fashioned "I told you so." Then we get to older Maddy, who is Bobby's Valentine's secret admirer and not Carrie Strug.
Grandma?
Happy Valentine's Day, boo-boo.
No!
Your grandmother loves you.
We then get to watch her chase a pig that Hank had let loose in the house during the episode's closing credits.
Mother, be careful! That woman in that movie was 30 years younger than you!
So we know from seeing her older version that her flashback appearances aren't just Peggy being an unreliable narrator. And this is something that becomes pretty important later on. In Happy Hanksgiving, we see her when Hank calls from the airport to tell her that their flight has been delayed, and we see a disagreement between her and Peggy about butter versus margarine.
I will need margarine and not butter.
Is that Peggy?
Yeah.
Tell her we use butter in this house.
Okay.
I'm a butter fan, by the way, so I totally get Maddy's stance here. Her final flashback appearance was in Transnatural Amusements Presents Peggy's Magic Sex Feet, when we see her taking a child-aged Peggy shoe shopping.
But, Mommy, I want my Mary Janes.
Oh, Peggy, it's not my fault your feet are growing and you're not.
I found something that can fit her.
Nurse's shoes?
So up to this point, Maddy hasn't been a bad mom. She's somewhat critical of Peggy, but she's not overly critical, nor is she mean-spirited towards her. And then we get to A Rover Runs Through It. I love A River Runs Through It, by the way. It's a great movie, but A Rover Runs Through It, well, it makes a lot of changes to continuity and more than some people realize. Like these guys. At one time, these two were listed on the King of the Hill wiki as Peggy's brothers, and several other sources claim the same. Even though there is no evidence of this, and I've always considered them to just be ranch hands. It's also strange that Maddy was a woman who loved her grandson enough to do that whole Valentine's thing, yet she never once interacts with Bobby in the entire episode. Okay, so let's get into how they changed Maddy Platter out of nowhere and for no good reason. First, rather than having her be present in their lives, suddenly Peggy hasn't spoken to her mother in 20 years.
Your mother? Wow, what's it been, 20 years?
Oh, and rather than being a homemaker, she's now been a rancher all her life, and Peggy has a completely different attitude towards her.
The nerve! She spends my whole childhood criticizing me and my whole adulthood ignoring me. Now she wants me to visit? What for?
Then we have her appearance. She now looks like this as opposed to what we have previously seen. And from her first interaction with Peggy after the family arrives in Montana, we see that she has a completely different demeanor.
Oh, Mom!
What?
She's not at all impressed with Peggy's three-peat as Substitute Teacher of the Year at Tom Landry, which, to be fair, she wouldn't have won that third one if Hank hadn't been disqualified and she hadn't put her name on the ballot as Mrs. Hank Hill. But her mom didn't know any of that, yet had a pretty uncalled-for response.
I won the Substitute Teacher of the Year award 3 years in a row.
Well, how about that? What was your subject? How to avoid a life of working with your hands?
No, it was Spanish.
Yeah, not exactly the most supportive mom there, and she keeps going, but luckily this gives us an opportunity to meet Peggy's dad, Doc Platter, voiced by Stephen Root, by the way, who speaks in what some call ramblings, but others like Hank see as genuine cowboy talk.
Uh-huh. What do you think about it, Doc? You ever have use for a substitute teacher?
Well, I suppose I can't tell you much. Them mountains can't tell you better.
The next day, we see Peggy attempt to have a conversation with Maddy, but something comes up.
Mom, I know that you and I have some real talking to do.
See that cow over there?
She's calving.
It's coming out backwards.
I also want to point out the interesting dichotomy here with Maddy up on her high horse above Peggy, kinda hinting at Maddy seeing herself as better than and above her daughter. The two are able to work together in order to birth a calf.
All right, I got the chains on. Get back here and help me pull. 1, 2, 3, go! He's out!
And afterwards, they seem to share a moment, and Maddy even takes on a more positive look with the scowl disappearing.
It has been a long time since I've seen that sight.
I see it hundreds of times a year, and it never stops amazing me.
But of course, then Peggy had to ruin that sentimental moment by trying to brag on herself, which, to be fair, she only does due to her feelings of inferiority that were instilled in her by her mother.
Can you believe it's been 20 years and I still calved a breech without missing a beat?
That's because you did what I told you. If you'd been out on the range by yourself, that calf would still be in there.
And yeah, Maddy doesn't take this very well. I don't think Maddy took anything particularly well, and she goes in on Peggy.
Why didn't you marry that boy from across the road?
What? Sven Grammersdorf? The alfalfa farmer's son?
He was a decent man from good stock.
Well, I did not have feelings for him, Mom.
No one asked you to. We were trying to run a ranch, not a feelings factory.
Now, real quick, if they moved to Texas when Peggy was around high school age, how young was she when they wanted to marry her off to old Sven Grammersdorf? I get the whole merging families and farms thing, but trying to set up a marriage for your daughter who is at her oldest early teens seems a bit too old-timey.
If you'd married Sven, we'd be doing all right. But you ran away.
But she moved to Texas with her, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't Peggy, a child, who made the decision to move from Montana to Texas. We do find out here why Maddy had invited them to all visit the ranch.
I invited you here so you could take a last look at your childhood home. We're losing the ranch.
Yep, because they were losing the ranch, and who's to blame for this turn of events?
It's all your fault. You and people like Henry Winkler.
That's right, Henry Winkler, TV's The Fonz.
Howdy.
But I do love how Peggy fills Hank in on everything in a rather efficient yet confusion-inducing manner.
We're losing the ranch.
What?
Owen, that's Henry Winkler.
Howdy.
What the hell is going on around here?
So the cattle trail that the ranch had used to move their cattle for spring grazing was on the Grammersdorf's land.
Van Grammersdorf?
That's correct, Hank, but the Grammersdorf sold their land to Henry Winkler.
Howdy.
After Sven Grammersdorf moved off to Seattle, and now Henry Winkler won't let them use the trail, hence the ranch failing and Peggy being unjustly blamed by Maddy.
Everybody got that?
Peggy gets the idea to look into old laws that might help them save the ranch, but Maddy even criticizes that.
Typical. You're on vacation for 2 days and you can't stay away from your book.
Peggy does find an old law that allows the town's main street to be used as a cattle trail if the one they typically use is unusable, and proceeds to basically reenact a scene from the movie Chisholm. This luckily causes Henry Winkler to concede his trail for their use, therefore saving the ranch. Afterward, Peggy has to be Peggy and brag about what she did, more or less begging her mom to acknowledge that Peggy saved the day.
Can you believe I got Henry Winkler to open up this trail? What do you think, Mom? Peggy Hill, educator, mother, rancher.
But yeah, this doesn't work, because of course it doesn't work. Maddy obviously doesn't like braggarts, and I think this is a huge reason why Maddy and Peggy do not get along. Peggy wants acknowledgement for her accomplishments, but Maddy clearly isn't a fan of people who want acknowledgement for their accomplishments, possibly because it makes them come off as they only accomplish something for the praise. Also, keep in mind that Peggy didn't save the ranch to help her family, she did it to get acknowledgement from her mother. So her reasoning was actually pretty selfish, and I think Maddy saw that. It's like the more Peggy intentionally digs for compliments, the less Maddy respects her, and Maddy's response here is a reflection of that.
You were just fixing the mess you made in the first place. And half them cattle in the drive wasn't branded yet. We could have lost them to rustlers.
This makes Peggy angry, and she storms out, swearing to do all the work until her mother loves her, but Hank calms her down and shows her why their trip was really worth it. And outside of showing up to Lucky and Luann's wedding, that's the last we see of Maddy Platter, though it does mean something that she would travel to Texas for her granddaughter's wedding when it's possible that she's never even met Luann. So, Maddy Platter was one thing, a homemaker who was present in her daughter's life and could be a little critical but always tried to compliment Peggy and be supportive, to a cold, mean-spirited lifelong rancher who Peggy hadn't spoken to in 20 years, even though we saw her previously. Oh, and she looked completely different. Some people have theorized that the Maddy we see before a rover runs through it was actually Peggy's stepmother, but that doesn't line up with her looking like Peggy. Honestly, it doesn't really line up in any way at all. Maddy was one character for multiple appearances, then suddenly in a single episode, she and Peggy's backstory completely changed with no explanation. This is a perfect example of how you don't do a retcon. It's possible that the writers only made a rover runs through it to make an episode about gentrification and the plight of people in low-cost areas when people from a high-cost area move in and start driving up costs. I live in Texas, I get it. But also try to explain why Peggy is who Peggy is by making her mother a black hole of joy and self-esteem that humbled her daughter whenever the opportunity presented itself, which doesn't work as a retcon and completely contradicts anything and everything concerning Maddy that came before it. Ultimately, Maddy Platter became a bitter, unloving figure towards Peggy, possibly due to Peggy's constant need for validation, but hey, maybe all Peggy needed to do for validation from her mother was to get a lifelong contract to an oil rig like her golden child did.
Oh, sure. But if my brother were making Brown Betty, she'd freaking lick the bowl.
Well, I never could figure what the sky was thinking. But the soil, she don't keep too many secrets.
I will never forget you, Doc Platter.